You want to know the one thing that actually makes a narcissist apologize? The exact same person who once looked you in the eye and told you your pain was not real. It is not begging them. It is not trying to explain your side. It is something far quieter and infinitely more powerful. Because the moment you do this, their certainty begins to crack. Their confidence stumbles. And they come back with the closest thing to real accountability that they are even capable of offering. Before I unpack exactly how to maintain these boundaries without slipping back into old patterns, hit that follow button and stay with me, because this next part is where everything finally starts to make sense. Narcissists do not apologize out of genuine empathy, simply because empathy is not the engine driving their relationships. What actually drives them is supply. They need attention, validation, power, admiration, and control. When a narcissist hurts you, they are not sitting there evaluating the emotional impact that their actions had on you. Instead, they are evaluating the impact on themselves. Did this situation threaten their public image, their personal comfort, their access to what they want, or their deeply held sense of superiority? If the answer is no, then there is absolutely no internal reason for them to feel remorse. Their emotional wiring naturally prioritizes self-preservation over human connection, which is precisely why they can walk away from your deep pain with such astonishing coldness. However, the second the consequences of their bad behavior start to inconvenience them, the entire dynamic shifts. If you decide to withdraw your attention, stop engaging in endless arguments, stop trying to explain your feelings, and completely remove the emotional energy that once fed them, they suddenly experience a massive disruption in their supply. That disruption is what finally wakes them up, not compassion. This is why their apologies almost always appear only when their access to you is directly threatened, when you become completely unavailable, or when their control over you starts slipping away. They begin to realize that their behavior now comes with a personal cost. And if there is one thing narcissists hate, it is paying emotional costs. Their version of an apology is purely transactional. It is a strategic move designed to regain equilibrium, not an expression of true understanding. When the environment around them changes and you refuse to act as the emotional cushion they rely on, they perceive a serious risk. That risk might mean losing you entirely, losing admiration, losing daily stability, or losing their preferred self-image. To counter that massive risk, they may offer you something that looks like accountability, But they are not suddenly discovering empathy. They are merely attempting to restore a personal benefit that they fear is slipping out of their hands. This is exactly why the calm, deliberate withdrawal of your energy affects them far more than any emotional confrontation ever could. Your total lack of reaction highlights the undeniable fact that they are losing their influence. For someone who survives entirely on control and attention, that loss is completely intolerable. The apology that eventually emerges is simply their way of recovering the balance that benefits them most. Your emotional withdrawal is so much more powerful than direct confrontation because narcissists are fueled by emotional intensity, not emotional understanding. When you confront them with anger, heavy tears, long explanations, or desperate pleas for change, you genuinely believe you are communicating your pain. But what they actually see is engagement. To them, engagement means they still matter to you. It means they still influence your daily life and still live rent-free inside your emotional landscape. This reaction is pure supply, and it keeps them completely energized. Even negative emotions feel like a comforting confirmation that they still hold ultimate control. On the other hand, emotional withdrawal creates a completely different reality, one that they are simply not equipped to handle. When you finally stop reacting, when your voice becomes calm and measured, and when you stop trying to convince them of your perspective, the entire system they rely on collapses. You are no longer a predictable source of validation or emotional stimulation. You become neutral. And neutrality is their absolute kryptonite. Emotional withdrawal is not the silent treatment, nor is it a childish punishment. It is simply stepping out of the rigid role they expect you to play. Instead of pleading for fairness, you become purely factual. Instead of explaining your position, you become remarkably concise. Instead of getting dragged into arguments, you quietly preserve your boundaries and your personal energy. This completely deprives them of the constant drama cycle that keeps them feeling superior or in charge. Narcissists desperately need your emotional reactions in order to maintain their psychological dominance over you. They provoke you deliberately just to keep you off balance. They criticize you so that you feel forced to defend yourself. They guilt trip you to make you explain your actions. When you emotionally withdraw, you deny them access to the exact reactions that feed their sense of power. This withdrawal forces them into a deeply uncomfortable position. Suddenly, they are completely unable to read you. They can no longer predict what you will do next. They cannot pull you back in with guilt, charming behavior, or subtle intimidation. They can no longer trigger you into fighting back. Your inner calm becomes deeply unsettling to them because narcissists automatically interpret a lack of emotion as a total lack of control. They start frantically questioning whether they are losing their grip on you. And that hidden fear eventually pushes them into behaviors they normally resist, including offering an apology. They do this strictly to reestablish an emotional connection, not because they genuinely understand the depth of your pain. Your emotional distance sends a clear signal that they are no longer impacting you the way they used to. That sudden loss of influence becomes the heavy pressure that compels them to act differently. However, boundaries only ever work when they are backed up by consistent action. Narcissists do not respond to soft words, deep emotions, or empty promises. They respond strictly to outcomes. You can state a boundary 100 times in a row, but if you continue to tolerate the exact same behavior, that boundary becomes completely meaningless. Narcissists will test your limits relentlessly. They watch you carefully to see whether your no is real or whether it can be pushed, guilted, manipulated, or emotionally worn down into a fine whatever. The exact moment they spot inconsistency, they interpret it as explicit permission to keep going. This is precisely why boundaries with a narcissist must be firm, calm, and consistently enforced. Otherwise, those boundaries simply become new opportunities for exploitation rather than real protection. When you back up a boundary with actual physical action, you shift the dynamic away from emotional negotiation and toward an undeniable reality. Instead of trying to convince them why their behavior hurt you, you simply change how you respond to it. If they start to yell, you quietly leave the room. If they insult you, you immediately end the conversation. If they cross a clear limit you have stated, you reduce your contact or limit their access to you. The absolute key to this process is follow-through. Narcissists push hard because they fully expect you to break under the pressure. When you do not break, you completely disrupt their internal map of how to control you. Consistency becomes the massive shock that cracks their sense of ultimate entitlement because it shows them for the very first time that their usual tactics are no longer effective. Enforcing consistent boundaries also changes you on a fundamental level. You completely stop reacting out of fear, deep guilt, or old emotional patterns. You start acting directly from a place of solid self-respect. This creates a remarkably stable environment where you no longer reward their bad behavior with free attention, lengthy emotional explanations, or constant engagement. Narcissists are not used to this kind of absolute stability. They are used to chaotic cycles where they provoke, you react, and they easily regain control. A consistent, unbreakable boundary shatters that cycle entirely. They eventually come to realize that certain actions lead directly to real, undeniable consequences. Whether those consequences mean physical distance, complete silence, reduced access, or the total loss of the influence they depend on so heavily. This realization can eventually push them into offering apologies or making temporary adjustments in their behavior. They do not do this because they truly grasp the deep meaning behind your boundary, but because your unwavering consistency introduces a real cost to their toxic behavior. Setting boundaries backed by real action forces them to recognize that you are no longer the person they can easily manipulate or pull back into old destructive patterns. A narcissist's absolute biggest fear is losing access, losing admiration, or losing influence, because these core elements form the entire foundation of their fragile identity and emotional survival. To them, relationships are never about genuine emotional connections. Relationships are simply resources to be gathered. You are viewed as a source of validation, attention, admiration, or practical utility. When that resource feels secure and easily accessible, they feel incredibly powerful. When that resource feels threatened, their entire internal world destabilizes. This is why they so often behave arrogantly, dismissively, or cruelly. They simply assume you will always stay, always forgive them, always explain your feelings, and always tolerate their behavior. They rely heavily on your emotional investment because it guarantees their sense of superiority and control. The exact moment that investment becomes uncertain, they feel a deep sense of panic that they will never admit to out loud. Losing access means they no longer hold an emotional or practical grip over your life. Losing admiration means they are no longer being seen as special, superior, or above everyone else. Losing influence means their ability to shape your emotions and direct your reactions is rapidly fading away. These losses attack their very identity because narcissists are completely dependent on external validation just to maintain their fragile self-worth. They are fundamentally incapable of generating internal stability on their own. Everything in their life depends on the attention they manage to extract from others. When you stop engaging with them emotionally, when you detach, and when you stop responding the way you used to, you trigger their deep fear of becoming entirely irrelevant. This fear often leads them to switch tactics rapidly. They may suddenly become apologetic, overly kind, or dramatically attentive toward you. They might even try to replay the original idealization phase just to pull you back into their world. Their apology is not rooted in true guilt or empathy. It is rooted strictly in fear. They sense that your emotional distance could soon evolve into physical distance, and that physical distance could evolve into a total loss of access. They apologize to re-secure their position, to keep the supply flowing, and to ensure they still occupy a place in your mind and life. Their deep fear of losing influence is also why they react so strongly whenever you show real independence, groundedness, or self-respect. To them, these positive traits are serious warning signs that you may no longer be under their emotional control. When admiration and access feel threatened, they experience an internal alarm that pushes them to do whatever is necessary to regain their position, including that rare moment where they offer an apology purely out of self-preservation. Calm detachment is so much more destabilizing to a narcissist than anger, simply because narcissists thrive on emotional volatility and predictable reactions. When you respond to them with anger, hurt, or frustration, you are still actively feeding their system, even if it feels like a confrontation on your end. Every emotional display, whether it is sudden outrage or desperate pleading, confirms to them that they still hold influence over your state of mind. They interpret your emotional intensity as concrete evidence that they matter, that they still hold a position of control, and that the drama cycle continues to function as expected. Anger can certainly escalate a conflict, but it rarely produces real change because it operates entirely within the rules of their game. It is a game they designed specifically to keep you reacting. Calm detachment, however, breaks all of those rules. When you detach calmly, you remove the predictable reactions that narcissists rely on to manipulate, provoke, or dominate you. You create an emotional vacuum that they cannot easily fill. Their usual tactics, such as provocation, blame shifting, guilt trips, and fake charm, suddenly stop working because those tactics depend on getting a reaction. Without that reaction, the patterns that maintain their sense of superiority begin to falter. They start to feel deeply confused and unsettled because the control they took for granted is no longer there. Your calm presence is unsettling because it signals that their influence is waning, that their emotional leverage is completely ineffective, and that the dynamic they relied on has shifted permanently. Calm detachment is not passive at all. It is a powerful form of strategic engagement. It communicates that you are still present, but no longer accessible for manipulation. You maintain your boundaries and your personal dignity without providing any fuel for escalation. Narcissists find this incredibly destabilizing because they are not used to facing resistance that does not provoke them emotionally. They are forced to confront the actual consequences of their behavior in a way that anger could never accomplish. When they recognize that their usual strategies are failing, they often feel immense pressure to adjust, negotiate, or even apologize. They do this not out of genuine empathy, but because your calm demeanor completely removes the advantage they once held over you. This approach shifts the power dynamic quietly, but remarkably effectively. It demonstrates clearly that emotional manipulation no longer works, that access to you is conditional, and that their influence over your life is limited. By choosing calm detachment over emotional confrontation, You destabilize the narcissist in a way that provokes self-reflection and corrective behavior while fully preserving your own peace of mind. You cannot teach a narcissist true empathy, but you can completely change the equation by changing your own behavior. Because narcissists operate purely from self-interest and need external validation rather than internal moral reflection, their emotional framework is simply not designed to process the pain they cause others in a meaningful or compassionate way. Confronting them with details of how their actions hurt you is highly unlikely to result in true understanding or remorse. They may nod along, feign agreement, or even mimic empathy to maintain control over the conversation. But genuine emotional resonance is rarely possible for them. Instead of trying to create empathy where there is none, the most effective strategy is to alter the very dynamics that make their behavior effective in the first place. By changing how you respond, you take away the precise tools they rely on, forcing them to operate differently if they wish to maintain access or influence. This means completely removing the emotional reactions that previously gave them power over you. It means enforcing your boundaries consistently so that any violations carry tangible consequences. It means refusing to justify, explain, or defend yourself in ways that fuel their sense of superiority. By doing this, you shift the balance of power from them back to you. The narcissist may not feel remorse in the traditional sense, but they will experience deep discomfort, frustration, and a sense of loss when their usual strategies fail. This discomfort is what can actually trigger an apology or an attempt to adjust their behavior, never empathy. Changing your behavior also communicates clearly that your emotional and psychological well-being is your highest priority. It signals that their ability to manipulate or exploit you is strictly limited and conditional. They are forced to confront the harsh reality that the old patterns no longer work and that you will no longer supply the reactions they rely on. In response, they may attempt reconciliation, offer an apology, or show temporary change. They do this not because they have genuinely internalized the harm they caused, but because maintaining their desired position or access now requires a completely different approach. By focusing on your own consistent actions, detachment, and self-protection, you create an environment where their bad behavior is no longer left unchecked. This approach does not rely on changing who they are internally, but it completely changes the way they interact with you externally.